On January 27, 2023, in an upscale residential area on the outskirts of the city, an incident occurred that would soon grab attention. As a man was driving a golf cart down a public road, he had no idea that what started as a routine traffic stop would quickly escalate into a tense confrontation. At that moment, no one could have predicted that this situation would lead to an arrest, rather than just a simple traffic citation. When Officer Jenkins instructed Steve to pull over for a traffic violation, Steve's reaction was immediate and unwavering. He slammed his foot down on the brake, coming to an abrupt stop, his eyes narrowing as he looked back at the officer. "I didn't do anything wrong," he yelled, his voice rising with a mix of indignation and defiance. "This golf cart is supposed to be on the road, right? Isn't this a major street?" His tone was sharp, as if challenging the officer's authority, a man clearly convinced of his righteousness. His arms crossed tightly in front of his chest, a physical manifestation of his stubbornness. He stood tall in his seat, as if he were ready to fight this battle on principle. His chest puffed out, Steve's face flushed with the energy of his conviction. He didn't realize that driving a golf cart on a public road was actually a violation of traffic laws, and in that moment, he felt like he was standing up for some great injustice. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles whitened, and his eyes sparkled with the belief that he was being unfairly targeted. Every word he spoke seemed to be more than just a defense. It was a proclamation of his innocence, as if the mere act of asserting it would make it true. His lips curled into a smirk, as though he were the victim of an elaborate plot. Officer Jenkins, a seasoned professional, had dealt with this type of confrontation many times before. He didn't flinch at Steve's outburst. Instead, he raised an eyebrow, maintaining an even expression as he leaned slightly forward. "Sir, this is a public road, and your golf cart is illegal here. I need to see your driver's license and registration," he said, his voice calm and composed. There was no need for anger or frustration. He had learned long ago to respond to belligerence with steady professionalism. But inside, Jenkins couldn't help but feel a subtle weariness. The stubbornness he encountered in people like Steve, who were too set in their ways to accept the situation, drained him. He was already bracing himself for the long, drawn-out conversation that was sure to follow. Steve, still caught in the momentum of his righteous fury, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His defiance grew stronger with each passing second. "You want my driver's license?" he scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "For what? I wasn't speeding. I'm just out here enjoying the ride." His hand waved dismissively, as though dismissing the officer's request as insignificant. Steve looked at Jenkins, searching for a hint of uncertainty in his eyes, but found none. The officer's calm response only seemed to fuel Steve's sense of injustice, making him feel as though the world was conspiring against him. Jenkins extended his hand, signaling for the documents, his patience stretched but still intact. He felt the weight of his professionalism, knowing that his response needed to be measured and composed, despite the storm of defiance in front of him. His fingers twitched slightly, but he kept his gestures controlled, signaling for Steve to comply. His thoughts were methodical, calculating how best to handle this growing standoff. Every moment that passed seemed to drain his energy just a little more, but he knew that the key to de-escalating the situation was to remain calm and not be provoked. Steve's posture remained confrontational. He leaned back, folding his arms even tighter, and shook his head in disbelief. "This is my property, officer," he said, his voice steady, but with an underlying edge. "I don't think you had any right to ask me for anything when I'm here. This is private land." His chest swelled with defiance, and his glare turned from the officer to the road ahead, as if his words alone could stop the situation in its tracks. He couldn't fathom how his actions, which felt so right to him, could possibly be seen as illegal. For a moment, Jenkins felt a pang of frustration, but he simply exhaled softly, his lips pressing into a thin line. This was routine. His hands still held out for the documents, his demeanor unwavering. Despite the tension in the air, the officer's calm composure made it clear who held control of the situation. Steve's defensive posturing was a visible struggle, but Jenkins knew it was only a matter of time before he wore the man down either through patience or persistence. The scene, charged with an undercurrent of rising tension, was about to unfold into something much bigger than a simple traffic stop. As Steve stood his ground, convinced he was in the right, Jenkins silently steeled himself for what was to come. Steve looked at Officer Jenkins with a dismissive sneer, his lips curling in disdain, as if the very thought of complying with the officer's request was laughable. "You want to see my license? For what? I wasn't speeding," he shot back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He gestured broadly toward the golf cart, as if it were some prized possession that should be exempt from the rules. "I'm just admiring the view," he added with a mocking tone, his eyes scanning the surrounding neighborhood as if to reinforce the idea that everything was perfectly normal. Steve's chest swelled with the confidence of someone who truly believed they were in the right, and the way he looked down at the officer, his chin tilted upward, betrayed a sense of superiority. His posture was rigid, and his arms, at first crossed, now uncrossed to gesture around in exaggerated confusion, as though the officer's request for proof was absurd, even insulting. He leaned back in his seat, one hand still loosely gripping the wheel as if to show how little the officer's authority mattered to him. His gaze never left Jenkins, as if daring him to challenge him further. "Come on, officer, do you really think this is necessary? I'm just driving around, not hurting anyone. This is a golf cart, for crying out loud, not a sports car." His voice grew louder, increasingly theatrical, as if he were performing for an unseen audience. Steve seemed to believe that sheer force of will and volume could turn the situation in his favor, and his antics were growing more exaggerated with each word he spoke. But despite Steve's bravado, Jenkins wasn't moved. Officer Jenkins, though outwardly calm, could feel the weight of fatigue starting to settle in. He had dealt with people like Steve before, individuals who believed that the rules didn't apply to them, who saw themselves as exceptions to the law. However, no matter how familiar these situations were, each one still carried the same emotional toll. He could feel the tiredness creeping into his bones, but he refused to let it show. Taking a deep breath, Jenkins let out a quiet sigh, his shoulders momentarily slumping before he straightened up once again. He could tell this was going to be one of those lawn exchanges. "Sir," he began again, his voice level but tinged with a hint of weariness, "you're driving a golf cart on a public road, which is a traffic violation. I need to see your driver's license and registration immediately." He didn't raise his voice, but his eyes had hardened, and his jaw was set in a subtle but unmistakable show of determination. He was no longer just explaining the situation, he was asserting authority, and Steve's defiant attitude had only made him more resolute in his request. Steve, still locked in his disbelief, scoffed again, now shifting in his seat, as if physically distancing himself from the officer's authority. He didn't understand why the situation was escalating. His mind was clouded with the belief that he was in the right, that his personal comfort and freedom were being infringed upon for no good reason. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, rolling his eyes, but his words were sharp enough for Jenkins to catch. He threw his hands up again, palms open in a theatrical gesture of frustration, as if to say that he was the one being wronged here. He leaned forward slightly, jutting his chin out, and for a moment, his gaze softened as if searching for some sign of weakness in the officer's resolve. But Jenkins remained stoic, unmoved by the theatrics. Steve's impatience was palpable now. He was no longer just defiant. His irritation had reached the point where he could hardly sit still. His legs tapped against the floor of the cart, and his fingers drummed on the steering wheel with growing agitation. He could feel the tension in the air thickening, but rather than diffuse it, he only seemed to heighten it. "I'm just doing what I want to do here. I'm not bothering anyone," Steve almost shouted, his voice rising again. His arms flung outward, as if the simple act of physically demonstrating his exasperation could somehow change the facts of the situation. Officer Jenkins had seen enough. The officer's patience, usually unshakable, was wearing thin, but he remained calm, his voice never wavering. "You're still violating traffic laws, sir," he said, his tone firm but respectful. "The law doesn't care whether you're bothering anyone. It's about safety, and you're breaking it. Now, I need to see your documentation." Steve hesitated, finally realizing that no amount of shouting or gesturing was going to change the officer's stance. Yet, his refusal to comply was not out of a lack of understanding, it was out of pure stubbornness. His defiance had become his shield, and he wasn't about to let it fall. His gaze fixed into the officer's eyes, trying to discern a crack in his resolve, but found none. Instead, all he saw was the quiet, unrelenting professionalism of a man who had long since learned how to deal with confrontations like this. And so the stalemate continued, with Steve sitting in his golf cart, tapping his fingers on the wheel, staring down the officer in silent protest, and Jenkins waiting, unmoving, for Steve to make the next move. Steve, who often prided himself on his knowledge of personal rights, suddenly grew arrogant. He crossed his arms again, shaking his head with disdain, as if he were debating a profound philosophical issue rather than just a traffic violation. "I don't think you have the right to ask for anything while I'm on my property. Isn't this my private property? You don't have the right to stand here." His tone was threatening, as if he were not just defending his personal rights, but condemning a serious invasion of privacy. He glanced around at his property, proud of what he had, and seemed to think that simply asserting ownership would instantly change everything. His defiance only escalated the tension, and no one could have predicted that this resistance would lead to unforeseen consequences. With an air of complete confidence, Steve failed to realize that he was escalating the situation, turning what should have been a simple traffic violation into a much more tense and awkward confrontation. As the situation became more heated, Steve's wife, Karen, could no longer stand idly inside the house. She stuck her head out the front door, her voice filled with anger and sarcasm. "You'd better call your supervisor. This officer has no idea what he's doing." Karen stood there, arms crossed, glaring with a look of defiance as if witnessing an enormous injustice. Her words did nothing to de-escalate the situation. Instead, they only added fuel to the fire. Officer Jenkins glanced over his shoulder at Karen, then sighed, feeling the weight of the situation. "Here we go again," he thought to himself, and with a calm demeanor, he reached for his radio, preparing to call for backup. "Sergeant Garcia, I need assistance. I'm dealing with an expert in property law and public roads here." While waiting for support, Steve grew bolder, beginning to lecture the officer about traffic law. He stood in the middle of the yard, pointing at the officer with increasing volume, as if he were teaching a legal class. "A traffic stop should happen right at the time of the offense, not wait until I get home and then ask for my papers. You can't follow me and then stop me in my driveway like you're a detective in a cheap movie." Steve sneered, feeling smug with his argument, as though he was winning the debate. Officer Jenkins silently nodded, trying to maintain his composure. "Sir, the violation occurred on a public road, and you still have an obligation to provide your identification," he replied patiently and calmly. But Steve's response only made things more tense. He continued to smirk as though he knew everything. "That's not how this works. You can't just follow me home and pull me over in my driveway like you're some low-budget cop in a cheap action movie." Steve looked at Officer Jenkins arrogantly, as if he were teaching the officer a lesson in how things should be done.
At this point, the situation wasn't just a confrontation between two men. It was a clash of two worlds. One side represented someone who considered himself knowledgeable about the law, while the other was an officer steadfast in his duties despite facing arrogance and defiance. Officer Jenkins could only stand there, thinking that this would be a much longer day than he had anticipated.
Fully prepared for a legal battle, Steve stood firmly in his driveway, pointing into the air as though arguing with a panel of judges. "This is my private property," he shouted, his voice as firm as if he were declaring ownership of the entire neighborhood. He even took a step forward, as if asserting control over the space around him. "You can't ask for my papers when I'm on my property. That's illegal," Steve said, puffing out his chest as if to prove that he understood all the regulations regarding land ownership and the law. His messy hair shook as he argued, and his hands clenched, as though trying to assert his dominance. Officer Jenkins, who was beginning to feel like time was slowing down, sighed and looked at Steve with weary eyes. He had no intention of engaging in a land ownership debate. "Sir, your violation occurred on a public road. You've just arrived home." "I'm still asking for your papers," Officer Jenkins said, his voice steady but resolute. He was simply doing his job, unwilling to get caught up in an unnecessary argument. But Steve wasn't about to back down. He stood firm, his eyes wide with the belief that he had uncovered a loophole in the law that no one had ever noticed before. As the fatigue crept into every movement of Officer Jenkins, Steve grew even more stubborn. He raised his hand toward the officer, demanding something that seemed impossible to fulfill. "Show me the evidence of this crime," Steve shouted, pointing at the officer's body cam as if it were the only tool that could prove his innocence. "If I'm going to hand you my papers, I need to see the evidence first." His voice grew louder, as if this demand was only natural. Officer Jenkins looked at Steve, bewildered as to why such a simple matter had turned into a prolonged confrontation. He calmly replied, "The evidence is on my body cam, sir. And you're currently obstructing an investigation." The response was nothing new, but it clearly added to the tension. Steve wasn't having it. He straightened up, puffing his chest out, his face set in a determined scowl, as if he were the lead character in a legal drama he often watched. "I need to see the law first, or don't expect me to hand over my papers," Steve repeated, once again asserting that he was the only one who truly understood the law in this situation. With every step Steve took forward, Officer Jenkins could feel the tension thickening in the air. Although he was tired and beginning to lose patience, he still tried to maintain his composure, simply waiting for the situation to resolve. But Steve wasn't backing down. He stood his ground, his expression full of self-satisfaction, as though he were participating in a legal debate with an inexperienced officer. Supervisor Garcia arrived on the scene, stepping out of the patrol car with a look of bewilderment, as if he had just landed in the middle of a circus. He paused for a moment, glancing between the two officers, then locked eyes with Steve, who was still standing tall in his driveway, arms crossed defiantly. Garcia looked like a man who had seen many strange things, but even he was struggling to process the bizarre nature of this traffic stop. He took a slow breath, then spoke with a calm that contrasted sharply with the growing tension. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but you were driving illegally on a public road. I'm giving you the option to provide your ID to avoid an arrest." Steve squinted at Supervisor Garcia, sizing him up, as if determining whether he was a worthy opponent in this legal showdown. He paused for a moment, his hand resting on his hip, then turned to Karen, who was still watching from the doorway, her arms crossed with a mixture of concern and skepticism. Steve looked at her with a pained expression, like a man being asked to choose between two equally undesirable options. "You hear that, Karen?" he asked, raising his voice so she could hear him clearly. "Arrested for a golf cart, a freaking golf cart." Karen, always quick with a dramatic flair, threw her hands up in exasperation. "Do what you have to do, Steve," she called out from the doorframe, her voice tinged with mock concern. "But don't forget, the kids are inside." She threw in one final, pointed look, as if her words carried the weight of the world, knowing full well that Steve was the one who'd have to face the consequences. Steve turned back to Garcia, now in full-blown protest mode, but there was a hint of resignation creeping into his posture. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he wasn't quite ready to back down. "Fine," he muttered through clenched teeth, the words heavy with bitterness. "I'll give you my ID. But this isn't right. I'm just a dad, trying to get my kids to school. This whole thing is ridiculous." His voice wavered slightly, a mix of frustration and disbelief, as he fumbled in his pocket for his license. The officer, unfazed by Steve's outburst, continued with the process, his eyes flat with professionalism. "You failed to comply earlier, sir. This is how it goes now," he said matter-of-factly, not a trace of sympathy in his tone. As the handcuffs clicked shut around Steve's wrists, the reality of the situation hit him all at once. He stood there for a moment, stunned, before his face twisted into a mixture of indignation and confusion. "I have a 6-year-old inside," he pleaded, his voice cracking with the desperation of a man who couldn't quite believe this was happening to him. "Please, I'm not a criminal." His words, tinged with panic, fell on deaf ears as Officer Jenkins, unbothered, calmly removed Steve's phone from his pocket. "Don't worry," Jenkins said, his voice cold and indifferent. "It's all going to St. Lucie County Jail. Now, go ahead and call your relative, but no more backtalk." Steve, still reeling from the sudden turn of events, stared at his phone in disbelief. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of the situation. "All I needed was an explanation," he muttered to himself, almost in disbelief. "This didn't have to be an arrest." He shook his head, as if trying to clear the fog in his brain. But the officers weren't interested in hearing his side any longer. The officer who had been handling the situation, clearly down with the whole ordeal, shot Steve a final, dismissive glance. "No," he said flatly, "it didn't." "But you made it one." The words stung, and for a moment, Steve felt his chest tighten, as the full weight of the consequences of his actions began to sink in. As he was led to the patrol car, He couldn't help but wonder how it had all spiraled out of control so quickly. The arrest that could have been avoided. The simple request for identification that had turned into something much bigger than it should have been. But in the end, it was clear. Steve had made it a fight, and now he had to face the consequences. Finally, after all the arguing and debating, Steve was escorted to the patrol car, a mix of shame and confusion swirling inside him. Looking back, he realized that his stubborn refusal to accept the reality, combined with his unreasonable defiance, had turned a simple matter into a serious situation. The lesson from this story is that sometimes, calmly accepting the law and facing reality head-on can help us avoid unnecessary trouble. Arguing with authorities or trying to evade responsibility only makes things worse. We cannot always defend our personal viewpoints when the law and public rules clearly stand on the other side.